Gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most underappreciated yet crucial campaigns of the American Revolutionary War, the retreat from White Plains and the subsequent operations that saved the Continental Army from certain destruction. This is the story of how George Washington, facing impossible odds, transformed what appeared to be a catastrophic defeat into the foundation for ultimate victory. If you're a veteran, active military, or simply someone who appreciates the finest traditions of American military leadership, this episode is for you. We're going to examine how strategic thinking, tactical flexibility, and sheer determination turned the darkest hour of the Revolution into a masterclass in military leadership that still influences doctrine today. October 1st through November 16th, 1776. For nearly 4 weeks, Washington and the main body of his army remained on the heights of Harlem. Think about that, gentlemen. 4 weeks of holding position while the most powerful military force in the world prepared to crush the American rebellion once and for all. The uneven ground, little more than a half-mile wide and except at a few points less than 200 feet above sea level, falls away precipitously toward the Hudson River on the west and is bounded for more than 2 miles by walls of primitive rock or obstructions deep and impregnable. This wasn't just defensive positioning, this was Washington thinking like a modern military strategist 2 centuries ahead of his time. He understood that terrain could multiply force effectiveness, that defensive positions could negate numerical superiority, and that time was often more valuable than territory. While his critics in Congress demanded aggressive action, Washington was playing a much deeper game. The British forces arrayed against him represented the pinnacle of 18th century military power. General William Howe commanded over 30,000 seasoned troops, British regulars who had served around the globe, Hessian mercenaries renowned for their discipline and ferocity, and loyalist militia who knew the local terrain. These weren't weekend warriors or hastily raised levies. These were professional soldiers backed by the unlimited resources of the British Empire. Washington's force, by contrast, had been reduced to fewer than 14,000 effectives. Many of these were militia whose enlistments would expire at year's end. Their equipment was a mixture of civilian hunting rifles, outdated muskets, and whatever weapons could be captured or purchased from sympathetic European merchants. Supply lines were non-existent, pay was months in arrears, and morale was understandably fragile after the disasters in New York. But here's what the British fundamentally misunderstood about their American opponents. They weren't fighting an enemy army in the traditional European sense. They were fighting an idea that had taken human form, and ideas are much harder to destroy than armies. Every American soldier who died became a martyr to the cause. Every British victory that came at high cost undermined support for the war back in Parliament. Washington understood this dynamic in ways that his European-trained opponents never could. The strategic situation in October 1776 was unlike anything seen in previous military history. Traditional European warfare followed established patterns. Armies maneuvered, fought decisive battles, and the loser either surrendered or retreated to reorganize for the next campaign season. But this was revolutionary warfare, where the very survival of the cause depended on preventing that decisive battle until conditions were more favorable. Washington's decision to maintain his position at Harlem Heights for 4 weeks was brilliant for reasons that wouldn't become apparent until much later. Every day that passed without a British victory was a day that strengthened the American position in ways that couldn't be measured in troop strength or artillery pieces. European observers were beginning to take notice of this colonial rebellion that refused to die. French officials, in particular, were starting to calculate whether British difficulties in America might present opportunities for France to settle old scores from the 7 Years' War. The logistics of maintaining an army in the field for extended periods presented challenges that tested every aspect of Washington's leadership abilities. Unlike European armies that could rely on established supply lines and well-developed infrastructure, the Continental Army had to create everything from scratch. Foraging became an art form, as small parties of soldiers scoured the countryside for anything that could feed, clothe, or arm their comrades. Washington's officers during this period included some of the finest military minds America would ever produce. Men like Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, and Alexander Hamilton were learning lessons in this crucible that would shape American military doctrine for generations. The intelligence war during this period was just as important as the shooting war. Washington established networks of spies and informants that kept him informed of British intentions while denying the enemy similar information about American dispositions. Local civilians, despite the risks involved, provided crucial intelligence about British movements and plans. This was asymmetrical warfare at its finest, using superior local knowledge and popular support to offset conventional military disadvantages. When Washington finally decided to abandon his positions and move toward White Plains, it wasn't because he had been forced out. It was because he had identified terrain that would be even more advantageous for the kind of defensive battle he wanted to fight. The move to White Plains was strategic repositioning, not retreat, though it would take historians decades to fully appreciate the distinction. The march itself demonstrated the kind of professional military competence that the Continental Army was developing under Washington's leadership. Moving 14,000 men with their equipment and supplies across difficult terrain while maintaining security and preventing desertion required the kind of staff work and unit discipline that rivaled any army in the world. European military observers who witnessed these movements began to revise their opinions about American military capabilities. White Plains offered exactly the kind of defensive terrain that Washington had been seeking. The village sat on elevated ground, surrounded by hills that channeled attacking forces into predictable approaches. Stone walls and rail fences provided ready-made defensive positions that could be improved with minimal labor. Most importantly, multiple roads provided escape routes if the position became untenable.
Washington's deployment at White Plains showed his growing sophistication as a battlefield commander. Instead of simply occupying the highest ground, he positioned his forces to create interlocking fields of fire that would maximize the effectiveness of American musketry while minimizing exposure to British artillery. He placed his most reliable units at key points while using militia to extend his flanks and provide early warning of enemy movements. The British approach to White Plains revealed both the strengths and limitations of conventional European military doctrine. Howe's forces moved with textbook precision, establishing camps, conducting reconnaissance, and preparing for what they expected would be another straightforward victory over amateur colonial soldiers. But textbook solutions often fail when facing unconventional problems, and the Americans had become very unconventional indeed. October 28, 1776. The day of battle finally arrived, and it would prove to be unlike anything the British had experienced in their American campaigns. Washington had approximately 9,000 men in defensive positions, facing 13,000 British and Hessian troops. On paper, the odds favored the attackers, but warfare is never simply a matter of numbers. The British attack developed according to classic European patterns, with formations advancing across open ground toward prepared defensive positions. What they encountered, however, was something entirely new in their military experience. American soldiers who fought from behind cover, who aimed at individual targets rather than simply firing volleys into the air, who understood that killing enemy officers was more effective than maintaining formation integrity. The battle for Chatterton Hill became the crucial engagement of the day, and it demonstrated how far the Continental Army had evolved since the early disasters around New York. When British General Alexander Leslie attacked the hill with 4,000 men, he expected to brush aside whatever amateur resistance he encountered. Instead, he found himself facing a mixed force of Continental regulars and militia who had learned to fight as a cohesive unit. The American defense of Chatterton Hill was a masterpiece of small unit tactics. Individual companies took advantage of every stone wall, every fold in the ground, every tree that could provide cover. When the British advanced in their traditional close-order formations, they presented perfect targets for American marksmen who had been hunting in these woods since childhood. The slaughter was methodical and devastating. But perhaps most importantly, the American soldiers at Chatterton Hill demonstrated something that had been lacking in earlier engagements. They held their ground. When Hessian grenadiers, some of the finest assault troops in the world, charged up that hill with bayonets fixed, they met Americans who didn't break and run. They met soldiers who stood their ground and fought back with everything they had. Joseph Reed, one of Washington's most trusted subordinates, later wrote about the transformation he witnessed in the American soldiers during this battle. Men who had seemed like amateur militia just months earlier were fighting with the discipline and determination of veteran regulars. The difference wasn't in their equipment or their training, it was in their understanding of what they were fighting for. The British and Hessian casualties at Chatterton Hill were far higher than their commanders had expected or could easily afford. These were professional soldiers who had campaigned across Europe, men who were supposed to be the finest military force in the world, yet they were being outfought by colonial farmers and shopkeepers who had learned their military skills on the job. Washington's personal leadership during the battle was exactly what his men needed to see. He positioned himself where the fighting was heaviest, sharing the dangers faced by his soldiers while maintaining the calm presence that had become his trademark. When junior officers reported that certain positions were under severe pressure, Washington personally rode to those locations to assess the situation and provide encouragement. The artillery duel that accompanied the infantry fighting showed how much the Continental Army had learned about modern warfare. Henry Knox's gun crews, many of whom had been civilians just months earlier, matched the British artillery shot for shot. They had learned to serve their pieces with the speed and accuracy of veteran gunners, and their counter-battery fire was effective enough to silence several British guns. As the day progressed, it became clear that the British assault had failed to achieve its objectives. The Americans had held their key positions, inflicted significant casualties on the attackers, and demonstrated that they could stand toe-to-toe with the finest soldiers in the world. For the first time since the war began, a major British attack had been decisively repulsed. But Washington understood that tactical success in a single engagement didn't change the broader strategic situation. The British still had overwhelming advantages in numbers, supplies, and naval support. They could afford to lose men in failed attacks far better than he could afford to lose them in successful defenses. The key was to preserve his army while looking for opportunities to strike back when conditions were more favorable. The decision to evacuate the White Plains position after successfully defending it demonstrated Washington's growing maturity as a strategic thinker. Lesser commanders might be tempted to hold the ground they had won, especially after such a morale-boosting victory. But Washington recognized that static defense would eventually favor the enemy, who could bring up heavy artillery and conduct a formal siege that would inevitably succeed. The evacuation itself was another masterpiece of military planning and execution. Moving 9,000 men with their equipment and wounded across difficult terrain while maintaining security required the kind of staff work that European armies took decades to develop. Yet Washington's officers executed the movement with precision that impressed even enemy observers. The British reaction to the American evacuation revealed their own strategic confusion. They had expected either to crush the rebel army in battle or to trap it in a siege. The possibility that the Americans would simply disappear into the countryside to fight another day was something their military doctrine hadn't adequately prepared for them. This was asymmetric warfare, and the British were slowly learning that their conventional advantages were less decisive than they had assumed. Fort Washington represented the next phase of this campaign, and it would test every lesson that Washington had learned about revolutionary warfare. The fort itself was strategically located to control access to the Hudson River, but it was also isolated and potentially indefensible if the British committed sufficient resources to its capture. Washington faced a crucial decision: commit troops to defend an isolated position or preserve those forces for future operations.
The intelligence reports reaching Washington painted a grim picture of the situation around Fort Washington. British forces were massing for what appeared to be a major assault, while naval forces controlled the surrounding waters. Any garrison left in the fort would be effectively trapped, unable to retreat if the position became untenable. The parallels to earlier disasters where American forces had been surrounded and forced to surrender were obvious and troubling. Washington's decision to evacuate Fort Washington, despite its strategic value, demonstrated his growing understanding of revolutionary warfare principles. In conventional European warfare, fortified positions were held regardless of cost because they represented tangible assets in any eventual peace negotiation. But in revolutionary warfare, the survival of the army was more important than holding any particular piece of ground. The evacuation of Fort Washington was conducted with the same professional competence that had characterized the withdrawal from White Plains. Artillery pieces were spiked or removed, supplies were either evacuated or destroyed, and the garrison was withdrawn without significant casualties. The British found themselves in possession of an empty fort rather than the substantial prisoner haul they had expected. This pattern of strategic withdrawal followed by tactical concentration would become Washington's signature approach throughout the middle years of the war. He understood that the British advantages in numbers and logistics meant that any prolonged engagement would favor the enemy. But by maintaining mobility and choosing when and where to fight, he could negate many of those advantages while preserving his own forces for decisive moments. The psychological impact of these operations extended far beyond their immediate military significance. European observers were beginning to understand that this colonial rebellion was unlike any previous uprising they had witnessed. The Americans weren't simply fighting to change rulers or adjust tax policies. They were fighting to create something entirely new in human history. That kind of motivation couldn't be defeated through conventional military means alone. French officials, in particular, were taking careful note of British difficulties in suppressing what had initially appeared to be a minor colonial disturbance. Every month that the American rebellion continued was a month that demonstrated British vulnerability and created opportunities for France to pursue its own strategic objectives. The possibility of formal French intervention, which had seemed remote in early 1776, was becoming increasingly realistic. The Continental Congress, meanwhile, was learning its own lessons about the nature of revolutionary warfare. Early in the conflict, many delegates had expected quick victories that would force Britain to negotiate reasonable terms. The harsh reality of prolonged conflict against a determined enemy was forcing a reassessment of American strategy and objectives. Total independence, which had been a radical idea just months earlier, was becoming the only acceptable outcome. Washington's correspondence during this period revealed his growing confidence in his army's capabilities despite the tactical setbacks they had endured. He understood that his soldiers were learning skills that couldn't be taught in formal military schools. They were learning to think independently, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to fight for principles rather than pay. These were advantages that no amount of European military training could provide. The logistics challenges faced by the Continental Army during this campaign would have broken lesser military organizations. Supply lines were virtually non-existent, pay was months in arrears, and equipment was a mixture of captured, purchased, and improvised items. Yet the Army held together through a combination of strong leadership, shared hardship, and commitment to the cause that sustained them when material incentives failed. The role of civilian support during this campaign cannot be overstated. Local farmers provided intelligence about British movements, offered shelter to American soldiers, and supplied food and equipment when official channels failed. This kind of popular support was something that British commanders, trained in European warfare where armies operated independently of civilian populations, found difficult to understand or counter. As November approached and the campaign season neared their traditional end, both sides began planning for winter operations. European military doctrine called for armies to go into winter quarters and suspend active operations until spring. But Washington was beginning to understand that revolutionary warfare didn't follow European conventions and that winter might actually provide opportunities that summer campaigning couldn't offer. The British decision to establish winter quarters across New Jersey represented both their strength and their vulnerability. They had sufficient forces to garrison multiple locations, demonstrating their control over occupied territory, but those scattered garrisons were also potentially vulnerable to the kind of sudden attacks that Washington was learning to execute with increasing skill. The Hessian troops who would garrison many of these winter positions were professional soldiers, but they were fighting for pay rather than principle. They had no particular investment in British victory beyond their contractual obligations, and they lacked the local knowledge and popular support that increasingly characterized American operations. This made them potentially vulnerable in ways that their military competence alone couldn't address. Washington's intelligence network was providing increasingly detailed information about British dispositions and intentions. Local sympathizers reported troop movements, garrison strength, and even details about officer routines and security procedures. This kind of intelligence advantage was something that European armies rarely enjoyed, and Washington was learning to exploit it with increasing effectiveness. The crossing of the Delaware River represented both a tactical withdrawal and a strategic repositioning. By placing the river between his army and pursuing British forces, Washington gained time to rest, refit, and plan his next operations. But he also positioned himself to strike back across the river when conditions were favorable, something that British commanders didn't initially appreciate. The Delaware crossing also demonstrated Washington's growing skill as a logistics commander. Moving an army with all its equipment and supplies across a major river in winter conditions required careful planning and flawless execution. The fact that this complex operation was completed without significant losses proved that the Continental Army had developed genuine professional competence under Washington's leadership. During the weeks following the river crossing, Washington began planning what would become one of the most audacious operations in military history. The attack on Trenton would require precise timing, perfect coordination, and the kind of tactical surprise that could only be achieved through superior intelligence and operational security. Every detail had to be planned and rehearsed because there would be no second chances. The soldiers who would execute this operation were not the amateur militia that British propaganda portrayed them to be. They were veteran soldiers who learned their trade in the hardest school possible, combat against professional enemies under impossible conditions. They had developed the kind of unit cohesion and tactical skill that European armies spent years trying to achieve. Christmas night, 1776, as Washington's army prepared to recross the Delaware, every soldier understood that they were participants in something unprecedented. They were about to attempt what no colonial force had ever accomplished, a successful attack against professional European troops in prepared positions. The odds were against them, the conditions were terrible, and failure would likely mean the end of the revolution. The crossing itself became legendary, immortalized in paintings and poetry for generations to come. But the reality was even more remarkable than the romanticized versions that followed. Washington personally supervised every aspect of the operation, ensuring that men, weapons, and equipment made it safely across the ice-choked river. His presence alone was worth 1,000 reinforcements to soldiers who had learned to trust his judgment absolutely. The march to Trenton through the winter storm tested the endurance of men who had already endured more than most armies could survive. Many were literally barefoot, leaving bloody tracks in the snow. Their weapons were old, their ammunition was limited, and their supplies were nearly exhausted. Yet they pressed on, driven by faith in their commander and belief in their cause that sustained them when material incentives failed. Washington's leadership during this march would become legendary among his men. He rode alongside them, sharing their hardships, encouraging stragglers, and maintaining the discipline necessary for the complex night movement. When officers suggested that the storm made attack impossible, Washington replied that the same conditions that hindered their advance would make Hessian vigilance even less likely.
The attack on Trenton was a masterpiece of tactical execution that validated every principle of revolutionary warfare that Washington had been developing. Surprise was complete, coordination was perfect, and the results exceeded even the most optimistic projections. In less than 2 hours, the Continental Army had achieved a total victory that transformed the strategic situation throughout North America. But the true significance of Trenton extended far beyond its immediate tactical results. For the first time since the war began, American forces had defeated professional European troops in stand-up combat. The myth of British invincibility had been shattered, and American confidence had been restored. Recruitment, which had been declining for months, began to increase as news of Washington's triumph spread throughout the colonies. The victory also demonstrated to European observers that the American Revolution was more than a colonial uprising that would quickly exhaust itself. French officials, who had been watching with interest but had been reluctant to commit resources to what seemed a losing cause, began serious consideration of formal intervention. The prospect of British defeat, which had seemed impossible just weeks earlier, suddenly appeared achievable. Washington understood that one victory, however dramatic, could not win the war. The British still possessed enormous advantages in men, money, and material. But Trenton had bought him something more valuable than tactical success. It had bought him time. Time to rebuild his army, time to train new recruits, and time to develop the strategies that would eventually lead to final victory. The weeks following Trenton would see Washington consolidate his gains while preparing for the longer struggle ahead. He understood that the revolution had entered a new phase, one requiring not just military skill, but political wisdom, diplomatic cunning, and strategic patience that few commanders in history have possessed. The crucible of that terrible winter, the Continental Army had been forged into an instrument capable of winning American independence. The lessons learned during those dark months, the importance of terrain, the value of intelligence, the power of surprise, and above all, the strength that comes from fighting for principles worth dying for, would echo through American military history for generations to come. This, gentlemen, is the foundation of American military excellence. Not just the ability to win battles, but the wisdom to know which battles to fight and when to fight them.
Washington's retreat from White Plains and victory at Trenton established principles that guide American military thinking to this day. Preserve your forces, choose your ground, strike when conditions favor you, and never ever give up when you're fighting for something worth preserving. The legacy of this campaign extends far beyond its immediate military significance. It demonstrated that citizen soldiers, properly led and motivated, could defeat the finest professional armies in the world. It proved that strategic thinking and tactical flexibility could overcome material disadvantages. Most importantly, it established that Americans would find a way to win, no matter how desperate the circumstances or how overwhelming the odds. This is our inheritance, gentlemen. This is the tradition we carry forward. When future generations ask what made American forces successful in conflicts around the globe, the answer can be traced back to those frozen fields outside Trenton, where Washington and his soldiers proved that determination, leadership, and courage can overcome any adversity.